You are 11 years old. It is dawn in Bronze Age Ireland, and the ground under your bare feet has gone from solid earth to something closer to a wet sponge. The air smells like wet moss, cold iron, and something faintly sour underneath it all. Mist sits low over the water, thick enough that you can't see where the bog actually ends. In your arms is a wooden keg wrapped tight in strips of bark, heavier than it looks. Your father told you exactly where to put it, not in the dry hillside where the wolves and the neighbors can both find it, but out here in the black water where nothing seems to be alive at all. You are about to bury food, on purpose, in a swamp, and somehow this is the smart plan. Here's the fact that should stop you cold before we go any further. Some of that buried butter has been found again, not last week, not last century, but after roughly 3,500 years underground. Recovered, tested in a lab, and in several documented cases still technically edible, not appetizing, technically edible. There's a difference, and we're going to get to exactly why in a few minutes. So here's the actual question, and it's bigger than it sounds at first. Butter is one of the most fragile foods that exists. It has no shell, no rind, and no natural armor. Left out on a warm day, it turns rancid within hours. And yet, with zero refrigeration, zero electricity, zero plastic wrap anywhere on the planet yet, people were making it last for centuries. Sometimes for stretches of time longer than most civilizations have managed to survive, using nothing but mud, cold, and patience. Somewhere between farmer with a shovel and chemist with a lab coat, there's a real answer. Hold on to that question. We are not answering it yet. Meanwhile, consider that a lot of modern people will throw out a carton of oat milk because it sat on the kitchen counter for 2 hours past its window. Bronze Age Ireland buried butter for centuries, dug it back up, and called it seasoning. Somewhere, a modern nutritionist is currently explaining the 2-hour rule for dairy left at room temperature, completely unaware that an 11-year-old in Bronze Age Ireland just beat that rule by roughly 30 million hours and walked away smiling. By the end of this video, you are going to trust a swamp more than you trust your own refrigerator. Stick around. It gets stranger from here. Burying butter in a bog wasn't a one-off trick that some clever farmer stumbled into once and never repeated by accident. It was one of at least half a dozen independently invented preservation systems, cooked up by cultures that had zero contact with each other, and in most cases, no idea the others even existed. Bronze Age Ireland, ancient India, parts of the Horn of Africa, the cold coasts of Scandinavia and the Faroe Islands. Different oceans, different centuries, different gods entirely, and all of them arrived independently at working solutions to the exact same problem. This wasn't a fluke that got lucky once. It was a problem that got solved over and over by people who had never heard of each other. Why it worked is simple enough once you see it. Why people started doing it in the first place turns out to be a much stranger question, and it's the one that's going to keep coming back around. And here's the part almost nobody mentions when they tell this story. None of it required magic, and none of it required luck. It required a working understanding of chemistry from people who had never once heard that word. The Irish weren't even the only ones doing this specific trick with this specific tool. Researchers studying the wider tradition have documented what one paper half-jokingly calls the butter eaters, communities across Scotland, the Faroe Islands, Norway, and Finland, all independently sinking butter into peat, alongside separate documented traditions of burying or fermenting butter as far away as Kashmir, Assam, and Morocco. Different languages, different gods. Same cold, black, oxygen-starved water. Same working solution, discovered again and again without a single letter passed between them. Butter spoils for exactly 3 reasons, and only 3. Oxygen breaks down its fats, turning them rancid. Warmth speeds up bacterial growth to the point where it multiplies out of control. And microbes, once they've got oxygen and warmth working in their favor, do exactly what microbes always do. They eat, they multiply, and they ruin your breakfast. Every single preservation method ever invented across the ancient world, no matter how strange it looks on the surface, is really just a different way of shutting off one of those 3 switches. Nothing more exotic than that. Nothing mystical. Just 3 variables, attacked from different angles by people who were paying very close attention. Take away just one of those 3 variables and you buy yourself days. Take away 2 and you buy yourself years. Take away all 3 properly, and you can apparently buy yourself millennia. Which is, when you actually think about it, an almost absurd amount of leverage to get out of mud, cold water, and low acidity, none of which cost a single ancient farmer a single coin. Bury butter deep in a peat bog and you've killed 2 of those 3 switches at once without ever touching a thermometer. There's almost no oxygen down there. The temperature barely moves, summer or winter. And the water itself is acidic enough and starved enough of air that bacteria essentially give up trying. This isn't folklore dressed up as science. This is refrigeration, built entirely out of mud and time, centuries before anyone on Earth had a word for a refrigerator. Call it the world's least convenient Tupperware. But it worked, and it kept working for longer than most modern corporations have managed to stay in business. That smell, for the record, is an acquired taste, mostly acquired by people who genuinely didn't have a second option. Other cultures went after the same three switches through entirely different doors. Salting draws water out of food, starving the bacteria that need moisture to multiply, the same logic behind salted fish and cured meat, just aimed at fat instead. Smoking adds a layer of antimicrobial chemicals straight from the fire itself, while drying out the surface at the same time. None of these tricks share a single ingredient or a single climate. What they share is a target. Every method everywhere humans have ever devised is aimed at the same three weak points, because those are the only three weak points that exist. Change the climate, change the available materials, change the century entirely, and the target never moves, only the tool pointed at it does. Here's the part worth sitting with for a moment. No refrigerator did not mean no food safety. It meant an older, slower, more patient kind of food safety. One built on decades, sometimes centuries, of carefully watching what worked and repeating it exactly, generation after generation, without deviation. These weren't wild guesses passed off as tradition. They were controlled, long-running experiments, refined by real consequences, and handed down as precise instructions because getting it wrong meant real hunger. Refrigeration didn't invent food preservation. It just made preservation lazy, quietly outsourcing to a machine a skill that used to require real, hard-won expertise. Now here's where this stops being a nice theory and starts being hard evidence, dug up out of the ground and tested under a microscope. Researchers led by Dr. Jessica Smythe at University College Dublin, working alongside Professor Richard Evershed at the University of Bristol, along with teams from University College Cork, Queen's University Belfast, and the National Museum of Ireland, sat down with more than 30 recovered lumps of bog butter, pulled from Irish peat over generations by turf cutters who had no idea what they'd found. Using lipid analysis and radiocarbon dating, this team confirmed something genuinely remarkable. This wasn't a short-lived local trend that fizzled out after a few decades. The practice stretched from roughly 1750 BC all the way into the 17th century AD. That is not a fad. That is longer than most religions have existed, longer than most languages, longer than every empire you could name put together with room to spare. And dating isn't a single lucky sample skewing the whole picture. Separate radiocarbon work on other Irish bog butter finds has clustered results across an even wider spread. Some samples from around 400 BC to 200 AD, others dated firmly to the medieval period, with the very youngest confirmed example dating to as late as 1739. Put plainly, this wasn't a brief Bronze Age experiment that fizzled out. Grandparents were still doing this exact thing, while other parts of the world were building steam engines. None of this evidence showed up in a single dramatic dig, either. For years, the National Museum of Ireland has worked directly with the country's turf board and with private individuals stumbling across these kegs by pure chance, cataloging each discovery as it turns up in someone's back field. This is less a single discovery and more an ongoing, decades-long inventory of a habit that never fully stopped, one accidental spade strike at a time. The containers themselves tell a second story on top of the dates. Some butter was packed into wooden kegs, some wrapped in bark, and some sealed inside animal bladders, each choice presumably shaped by whatever material a household actually had lying around that season. None of it was accidental. Every wrapping choice was still, fundamentally, another attempt at the same three-variable problem, keeping air and warmth as far away from the fat as possible for as long as possible. The bog itself does the heavy lifting, and it does it without asking for a single ounce of human effort once the keg goes under. Cold, low oxygen, highly acidic, conditions that are miserable for almost every living thing on the planet and perfect for exactly one very specific job, stopping decay dead in its tracks. Some of what gets pulled out of the ground today has gone waxy and pale, closer in texture to an old candle than to anything you'd spread on toast. And yet chemically it has survived, not spoiled the way common sense says it should have. Preserved in the strictest possible sense of the word for thousands of years, sitting quietly in the dark the entire time. Here's the genuine mystery buried in the data, the one researchers still openly disagree about. Nobody can cleanly separate practical storage from ritual. Some of these buried kegs turn up right alongside deposits of gold ornaments, bladed weapons, and other objects that were clearly placed with real ceremony, not casual convenience, which raises an uncomfortable possibility. Some of what looks like just food storage might actually have been an offering, food given deliberately to the bog, or to a river, or to something entirely unseen, in exactly the same spirit as people giving up their finest tools and their most valuable jewelry. Nobody has drawn a clean line between the two categories yet. Nobody may ever be able to. We don't fully know, and the researchers involved are honest enough to say so directly rather than papering over the gap with a confident guess. Strict, repeated patterns have been observed in how gold objects, axes, and finely made bladed weapons were deposited in bogs during the early Bronze Age, clearly deliberate, clearly meaningful, clearly not accidental loss. Food, historically, has been treated as a boring afterthought by comparison. But boring afterthought. Uts don't usually get buried with this much consistency, this many times, across this many centuries. Sit with that for a second before we move on. If some of what we've been reading as just storage was actually sacred, what else have archaeologists been quietly misreading for 100 years? And yes, before you ask, people have tasted it. Not the modern scientists, mostly, who tend to prefer their lipid analysis over an actual bite, but curious food historians and the occasional brave museum visitor have sampled small pieces of recovered bog butter out of pure curiosity. The general verdict lands somewhere between sharp cheese and old candle, with a texture that's more wax than spread. Nobody is opening a restaurant around it. But nobody who's tried it has gotten sick, either, which is, quietly, the most impressive part of this entire story. That question gets a lot bigger the moment you realize butter wasn't only food in these societies. It was money. Historical records describe raids specifically targeting stored butter, organized, deliberate theft, the kind of crime you only bother planning when the thing being stolen is genuinely, seriously valuable. Entire households staked real, tangible security on the assumption that a hole in a swamp would hold up its end of the bargain months or years later, which reframes this whole practice as something closer to a financial system than a kitchen trick. Functionally, it's no different from a modern grain silo or a bank vault, an asset, deliberately stored somewhere defensible, expected to hold its value reliably over long stretches of time. Walk into a modern bank today and tell the manager your long-term retirement plan is bury it in a swamp, and you will be laughed straight out of the building. And yet that exact plan outperformed most human financial institutions for sheer reliability, by roughly 3,500 years and counting. Think about what that actually implies about daily life. A household's wealth wasn't sitting in a locked box under a bed where anyone could find it in an afternoon. It was scattered deliberately out in the landscape, a keg here, a keg there, memorized by location rather than written down, because writing it down defeated the entire point of hiding it in the first place. Losing track of your own bog map was functionally identical to losing your savings account. No customer service line. No password reset. Just mud, memory, and hoping you counted your paces correctly on the way out. The Bronze Age equivalent of forgetting where you parked, except the stakes were dinner for the next 3 winters. Food security, in other words, wasn't an abstract concern for these communities. It was a daily, physical fact of life, solved the same way modern nations solve it, through stockpiling, distribution, and defense, just at a scale of 1 household and 1 bog instead of 1 government and 1 warehouse. Somewhere out there, an ancient butter thief is the original heist movie villain, and absolutely nobody has ever given him the credit he clearly deserves. Every culture facing this problem solved it differently, because every culture was fighting a genuinely different enemy. In Bronze Age Ireland, families moved seasonally with their cattle up into the hills during the warmer months, leaving preserved butter behind wrapped carefully in bark, wood, or animal hide, trusting the cold water and the acidic peat to hold it steady until they made their way back down. Half a world away in ancient India, somewhere between roughly 1500 and 500 BCE, the enemy wasn't cold at all, it was relentless heat. Raw butter left out in that climate would turn rancid within a single day, sometimes less. So instead of burying it in the ground, people slow-cooked it, simmering it patiently for hours until the milk solids and the water, the exact ingredients bacteria need in order to thrive, separated out cleanly, and could be skimmed off the top and discarded entirely. What remained afterward was ghee. Golden, richly aromatic, genuinely shelf-stable, able to sit safely in a warm kitchen for months at a time without spoiling, and considered important enough to be named directly in some of the oldest surviving religious hymns still known to exist. including verses from the Rig Veda dating to roughly 1500 BCE. This wasn't a side dish. Ghee shows up in early legal and religious texts as a substance worth regulating, worth ritualizing, worth pouring onto sacred fires as a formal offering. Centuries later, traditional Indian medicine would go on to credit it with everything from easing digestion to calming the nervous system, a reputation built, at its foundation, on the much less glamorous fact that it simply refused to spoil. Picture what that seasonal migration actually meant on the ground. An entire household, cattle, children, tools, and whatever food couldn't survive the trip, moving uphill together for months at a stretch, while the one thing they couldn't carry with them got left behind on purpose, trusted to a hole in the ground more than it would have been trusted to a locked room. That's not primitive planning. That's a supply chain running on nothing but memory and mud. Same starting ingredient, taken from the same kind of animal, and yet two completely different funerals waiting on the other end. In Ireland, butter got buried, treated like something sacred enough to protect and hide. In India, butter got slow-cooked down and poured directly onto sacred fires as an offering to the gods themselves. That's not a coincidence sitting quietly in the historical record. That's a pattern. Preservation wasn't invented once by one especially clever culture and copied by everyone else afterward. It was invented independently, at minimum twice, by two sets of people solving the exact same equation using completely different available variables. That equation never actually disappeared from the world. It just went quiet and eventually invisible. Modern food science has a clinical, slightly boring name for exactly what these two cultures were doing purely by instinct and centuries of careful trial. Controlling water activity and oxygen exposure. That single principle is the entire foundation behind vacuum sealing, behind canning, and yes, behind the same clarified butter still sitting today on pantry shelves in millions of homes around the world, sold specifically because it does not require refrigeration to stay safe. The underlying chemistry has not changed in 3,000 years. Only the packaging around it has. The refrigerator didn't replace any of this ancient knowledge. It just made it invisible because nobody alive today has to think about any of it anymore. Most people right now couldn't keep a single stick of butter edible for one full week without a working fridge, let alone 36 centuries buried in a swamp. And yet every single, shelf-stable, label sitting quietly in a modern grocery aisle is running a playbook that was first written by hand, by candlelight, by people who got it visibly wrong for generations before they finally, patiently, got it exactly right. Walk down any grocery aisle today, and you're walking through a museum nobody labeled. Ghee still sits on shelves unrefrigerated, sold on the exact same principle that made it useful 3,000 years ago. Canned goods rely on heat and a sealed environment to strip away the same three variables, oxygen, warmth, microbes, just achieved with a factory instead of a fire pit. Freeze-dried meals, vacuum-sealed meats, long-life milk in a shelf-stable carton. Every one of them is a direct descendant of a farmer in a bog and a cook in a hot kitchen, both arriving independently at the same three-part answer, thousands of years and thousands of miles apart without ever comparing notes. Ghee to this day is still sometimes called liquid gold, a nickname it earned the honest way by simply refusing to spoil when everything around it did. Not marketing, not nostalgia, just 3,000 years of a substance. See quietly doing exactly what it was engineered to do, long before engineered, was even a word that applied to food. Trust, it turns out, is the actual ingredient nobody ever puts on the label. Trusting a process you personally cannot see working, based on nothing more than the plain fact that it worked the last time, and the time before that, and every single time before that one. Which brings you back to the bog, and back to being 11 years old, cold feet, the keg finally gone from your arms and lowered out of sight beneath the water. Somewhere behind you, your father is already walking toward the hills, not looking back, because he has done this before and it has worked before, every single time he's tried it. You are not performing some ritual you don't understand. You are following a process refined carefully over centuries by people who paid close enough attention to cold, heat, water, and air to turn an ordinary swamp into a working machine, long before anyone alive had the word chemistry to explain exactly why any of it worked. You glance back once at the water's surface, already going still and calm again, already hiding whatever it's now holding underneath. Then you turn and you walk home.